Okay. Hello and happy warm Friday. Welcome. Thank you all for being here this evening. My name is Heather Duffy. I'm the exhibitions curator here at UICA. I'm very happy that all of you are here and very excited to introduce our panel in just a moment. We are so honored to present More Than a Woman, an exhibition by Nakeya Brown here at UICA, and we're very excited to host this conversation as an extension of that exhibition. We're really excited to remind everyone that we're celebrating tonight the release of the More Than a Woman catalog, and this evening books will be available for purchase and signing after our conversation. I'd like to give a very big and heartfelt thank you to everyone who contributed to the work of producing this publication. We're so happy to see it and to share it with all of you. We'd also like to thank our members. Your ongoing support and presence is critical to our success. And I'd personally like to thank the members of our steering committee for UICA's 40th anniversary programming. Many of our committee members are here this evening, and I just can't thank you enough for continuing to show up in such a big way. Thank you to our sponsors, who are Ferris State University, Conduit Studio, the Daniel and Pamela DeVos Foundation, the Dick and Betsy DeVos Foundation, National Endowment for the Arts, and the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs. I'd also like to thank the Wege Foundation and Vault Catering and Events. And from here, I will turn over to introduce Andy Johnson, Martina Dodd, and Nakeya Brown. I hope that you'll all tell us a little bit about yourselves as we begin. Thanks again. A note to everyone, we're just going to leave the door open and have people continue to come in. Please welcome them and know that we will celebrate together with a reception on the first floor as soon as we wrap our conversation.
Hello, good evening. My name is Nakeya Brown, and I'm the artist that's on view in the More Than a Woman space upstairs. A little bit about myself. I work primarily in photography, and my work is really centered around thinking about Black female identity, particularly through objects, through interior spaces, through beauty politics, through the body, through hair, and thinking about ways to complicate how all of sort of these experiences sort of like inform my being and my history. So there's a lot of staging that takes place and sort of like construction, and we'll kind of talk about that more in detail. I'm also an educator, and I'm from DC. And I'm also a mother. I'm a very, very excited new fiance. And I'm excited to like talk more critically about my work so you guys can, learn more about me.
Hi, my name is Martina Dodd. I am based in DC. I'm an independent curator. My background is in anthropology and art history. And a lot of times I'm approaching art in a way to kind of have a better kind of cultural understanding of the work, the pieces, the people that are shown. So that's why I was really attracted to Nakeya's work, because she uses a lot of objects in her work and kind of what stories are told without really speaking, without a person to kind of, to be that mouthpiece for. So like work like this, like, what does collard greens and hair have to do with each other, you know?
We'll talk more about that.
Yeah, we will. So I think her work is really intriguing. So I'm excited to really talk about this.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Johnson. I am a curator, art historian, and I'm currently the director of Gallery 102 in DC. My sort of academic and curatorial sort of perspectives center around queer theory, feminist and black feminist theory, cultural studies, critical race theory, photography, video, performance art, a lot of things. I got my master's at GW in art history, which is where I originally met Nakeya. And so yeah, I'm really excited to talk about your work because I've seen it for so many years, and I'm just like, I love talking about your work, so I'm really excited.
And that was actually a reason why I picked Martina and Andy to be on my panel, because the three of them have had multiple viewpoints of my work, like as audience members who we didn't know each other, but they saw the work before they saw me, so they kind of came to it with not like an intimate read, but then they've also done they've been critics in studio visits and told me like, I like where this is going, or like this, you might think about this a little bit more. And they've also curated my work on multiple levels. So they have a really full viewpoint of like how I think and how I approach image making, and like who am I reading and what am I thinking about. So that's just a little backstory as to why I chose these two individuals to be on stage with me as we're like talking more about the pieces.
So what was your first kind of entry point to photography?
Yeah. So I would say, I would think like I studied photography as an undergrad. So it was sort of like my sophomore, junior year in college when I really started thinking about photography critically and thinking about photography as a medium for sort of like expression, and like thinking like, okay, so a photograph can really carry a lot of weight. A photograph can be a way of communicating a visual story. A photograph can be all of these things that hold meaning. And so studied photography for, 2 years as an undergrad. And then I went on to work as a photo rep in the commercial industry for 4 years. And that's when I started to see like the bread and butter that's involved in photography, and really not only thinking about photography from like a social documentary perspective, which was really driven in undergrad, but also thinking about it commercially and thinking about the ability to really create your image. And I think it was a combination of thinking about the little bit of truth that is innate to the medium of photography, and then also working in the commercial industry and seeing like all the artifice that's also tied to photography. So I would say that like as an undergrad, that's what really shaped sort of like my foundation, but then also working commercially in the industry for so long really sort of helped me think about the play and the metaphors and the different ways that you can really like use photography as a medium to really say something specific, and say it specifically visually, like not necessarily through words, but thinking about how you can build like a visual story and like what is necessary to build that visually. Yeah, if that.
It's funny because, Andy, you mentioned a book that you're reading now, Troubling Visions. And I was looking at this on the way here, and there was a quote that she mentioned how vision is more of a social practice than actually kind of a physical thing of seeing something, but we're taught through society how we should picture something.
Right.
And mentioning how photography has truth to it is interesting that you see it as truth, but also kind of like trickery in a way sometimes.
Yeah. Because I mean, photography in its history has always been about like looking and like the examination of bodies, examination of like a scene, a site. It's just always been about sort of like sight and describing what's there. And I definitely think my work is about looking, but I also want people when they come to my work to also feel something. And I think that's sort of where the trickery comes into place, and sort of like the personal comes into place, specifically where I'm like thinking about the work that looks at sort of like hair stories and hair politics and the way that they're sort of dressed through color, and there's like these palettes that make you feel feelings, or thinking about if nostalgia were colored brown, and thinking about like the nostalgia that comes to looking at these images, and just photography's ability to activate sort of like deeper meanings beyond just sight and deeper feelings beyond just like looking. So yeah, my work is definitely not about like coming to and looking and being like, this is a photograph of, like for this photograph, it's like a phone on top of a blow dryer on top of a rotary phone with like an open case of hair grease. So it's like kind of like you cannot come to my work and just look at it and walk away. Like it always sort of like cues a question from the reader or from the viewer to say like, what exactly is happening here? And I think that like the disruption of like the casualty and the ease of just taking something and looking at it is sort of like how I trouble vision, and thinking about how you can sort of center, you know, Black female subjectivity at that is even more of a way of sort of like encouraging the viewer to not take what is there as just what is there. Like there are codes and there are layers, and there's she's obviously like trying to build something for me to read deeper than just like looking and seeing. So I think that's how I sort of trouble vision, and like, you know, I keep hitting the microphone on my on my tooth. I don't know.
Yeah, so it was actually the second time that I read Troubling Vision, because I think the book is just so incredibly dense, and there's so much to unpack, because she talks about photography, theater, performance art, music videos, fashion. Like she goes through so many different sort of cultural modes of production. And I think my second time reading it, my biggest takeaway was the way that Blackness in sort of the visual scope troubles our vision, because of this sort of duality of the hypervisibility versus the invisibility, the sort of notion that Blackness is all knowing, like we're able to sort of understand it, but it's also othered. Like it's an interesting sort of dynamic between one side where sort of the discourse centers around understanding Blackness and Black femininity and Black sexuality in very specific categories and very specific ways, but at the same time it being sort of unable to sort of understand it. It's this very interesting dichotomy between the two. And I think that's the way that I sort of see Nicole in her book, looking at Blackness in sort of understanding. And sort of one of the biggest, I guess, the larger takeaway for me was that in this notion of representation, that just by having, it's not necessarily just by having Black bodies in the space, but how those Black bodies are sort of constructed and perceived. So she looks at sort of music videos and the presence of sort of the video vixens in a lot of sort of 90s and early 2000s rap videos. And sort of you can have 100 of those Black women in a video, but you're not necessarily changing the way that they're talked about or the discourse that's surrounding their subjectivity. So it's not necessarily just like inputting them into the visual space, but it's changing the way that they're talked about. Sort of a paradigm shift of looking at the dynamic, sort of the dynamism and sort of the complexities around it, and not necessarily looking at it as one single note. They exist and they sort of experience their subjectivity in a million other ways that society doesn't want to understand. They're unwilling to sort of compromise to that notion.
Yeah, I definitely think you raised a good point about like you can have 100 women in a rap video, but that's not changing sort of the way that those women are being contextualized and like over-sexualized. And I definitely think that that is, in my work, like I definitely want to change that paradigm in terms of the image and the photograph and how you can attach like subjectivity to an image. And like that's something that I was, well, in my later works, like this is some of the earlier works I made in like 2012, where I was really interested in like using the body and trying to like create an image that sort of depicted an experience through the body. And I kind of moved away from that and wanting to use objects. So I think in a response to that comment, like my response in trying to change the paradigm is sort of like, how can I take the body out of a photograph but still communicate like this is very much a bodily experience, or this is very much a body of work that is relating to Black women's lived experiences, which like includes their bodies. So I think that's that was also something I was thinking about, is like, how do I not put the body at the center of sort of like these critiques that I'm making about, you know, beauty standards, about sort of the way in which women, we have to navigate and change ourselves to sort of like adhere to certain beauty codes. And I think that that's a reason why my work has sort of had success, because it's, okay, she's talking critically about like body politics, but there are no, like, but she's looking at it like without the presence of the body at the center. So there's sort of like, again, another level of like troubling sight and troubling vision, or this sort of like irony in which you're talking about something that isn't actually present or isn't actually there. But like an image of a hot comb on a burner is so deeply rooted in like Black girlhood and Black womanhood. And so again, it's like trying to expand the way that we describe Black womanhood. Like, what does you know, Black women's cultural production look like? Like, it is like a very, that is what I strive for as a photographer, is to expand like what represents these sorts of things. And I don't think it always requires putting a body at the center. So yeah, at your point, like that's sort of my approach to, you know, trying to not put 100 women in the middle of a rap video and say like, oh, well, now there's visibility because we're all here. But, you know, it's, no, like you have to really like change the paradigm in a way that is like, oh, you're like, I'm here, but I'm not like actually here, you know, if that makes sense.
I think that's what I love the most about your work, is that the body never actually really disappears, but it is, the sort of objects stand in for the body in interesting ways that sort of point to, how do we think about bodies then? Like, it's very noticeable that the body is not in this frame, so how are we associating the body with these objects?
Right.
Why are we associating the body with these objects? And so that's what I love the most, is that even though bodies may, like in this photograph, the body does not exist literally in that photograph, but it's always, it's sort of a haunting over those objects. It's always there, it's always connected to those objects.
It's almost like it's omnipresent in a way.
Right.
But also the stories that we're getting from these images without bodies are very different from person to person. I think a lot of your work, especially ones when you have like faceless portraits where the woman is kind of concealing her face, like this image, or in some of your other work where like we saw before, where she's turning her back on the photographer. Like yeah, okay.
Turning my back on myself.
So you're like, it's a very conscious effort to kind of keep something personal, or maybe like not to expose everything to the audience. And in a way, for me, it's kind of like, I think I'm reading right now Bell Hooks' Race and Representation, and kind of thinking about being conscious that you're being observed and how you then act because you know someone's watching you. And a lot of these works, I feel like you know that someone's gonna watch this or see this, and you're purposely omitting or revealing something. And I really like that coded language, because for me to look at this, I know that it's a perm box because I grew up getting perms. But someone else may not know what that is. They might think, that's a pretty purple, and like, oh, that's a jar of liquid, I don't know. You know, so like the conversations you're having with people probably vary. Are you ever in situations where you are explaining things? I know you were in a show that I did called Public Displays of Privacy, and a lot of this work was in it. And there's one image where there's a satin pillowcase. And I remember having a conversation with someone, and they were like, I don't get it. Like, you know, what is this explaining? And I was like, oh, it's a satin pillowcase. So, and I was like, well, you know, if I want to go to sleep and I don't want my hair to get messed up, I'll wear a cap or I'll wear a satin pillowcase so it's not rubbing against like the harsh cotton. And like this conversation and this kind of like action I do day in and day out was normal for me, but for someone else, this is a totally new world. So do you ever feel like you're kind of exposing these kind of Black beauty rituals? And how do you feel about, putting us on blast?
I don't think I'm I don't think I'm putting us on blast like that, because you can always say like, I don't want to answer your question, or you could be like, I don't know. But I don't really feel like it's a putting on blast. I mean, I feel like it's more of a, well, why do we keep this in the confines and the corners of our houses? Why do we have to keep this a secret? Like, white women were allowed to like go out and burn their bras and be like, I don't want to wear this bra, I'm gonna throw my lingerie in the street. And so for me, it was more of like, taking this sort of like ritualistic, very private, very personal processes that we do and being like, I think that they are beautiful, and I think they are also traumatizing, and I think that I am not fully settled. I'm gonna make a body of work around this. And I'm also a mom. I have a super, super duper 4-year-old who's at home sick right now, so she couldn't make it. And I like wanted to make work for her. Like, after I became a mom, I was like, I want to make work that like my baby can look at it and be like, my mom made this, and this is what she was thinking about. This is sort of like what we do. This represents us. This represents our story. And like I said, because it wasn't fully resolved internally, and I just kind of was like, well, this is like a great way for me to try and work through this creatively and through my practice. So it's never for me about like an exposing, because that sort of seems like there's like sort of a negative connotation that comes to like the word expose. So I think it's more of a like taking what we do privately and we sort of like keep in the confines and the dark corners of our like girlhood and womanhood, and saying like, hey, like this is actually really beautiful and really interesting, and it's art, and it's also like really complicated, so that, let's figure out a way to like visualize it and have a conversation about it and talk about like why it has a right to be here. And that's kind of where I think it goes. Because I've had that question like come up multiple times in interviews. Like, how do you feel about putting this stuff out there and like letting everybody know like this is what you do, and you're kind of putting the dirty laundry out on the street? And I'm kind of like, well, it has to get washed, right? Yeah. Like it has to get washed. So, it's Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. And a lot of your work, all of this work is shot or staged indoors. And
Yes.
when you have objects standing in for people, a lot of them are like associated with domesticated roles. So if they're not related to hair, they're related to like something that's in the kitchen, or you have like clothespins, you have silverware. Kind of what are those things? Why are they significant to your work?
So more on a like practical level, after becoming a parent, you realize like you don't have time to be outside in the world with humans. And I spent a lot of time just like going to work, going home, going to work, going home. I spent a lot of time just like in my house. And I think that sort of subconsciously conditioned me to sort of like examine, what do I have in my living room? What do I have in my kitchen? Like, what is in my bedroom that I can sort of bring into my pseudo studio, which is actually my living room, and like make work? So I would say sort of working with interior spaces, interior objects, grew out of like a literal shift in my personal life of being a mom and like just spending a lot of time like at home. And that was fine. And I also, just like in the process of like trying to understand what it is that intuitively drives me to do these things, like what is the history that's tied to this intuition? Like what is it, like what other women photographers or women artists, like how are they thinking about the domestic space and the interior space? So I did a lot of, reading, also reading bell hooks and, her recounting of the kitchen and doing hair in the kitchen, working on your, gas stove to heat your hot comb, and, thinking about sort of like how these spaces within the home are also tied to like the building and the structuring of beauty, and how these spaces are beauty spaces, whether it's girlhood or whether it's womanhood. And then also just through my research, like thinking about the interior space and the designing of interiors and interior design, that's how, that was how women were able to enter into sort of like modern architecture, was through like working in the home and doing like interior design. So like the interior, as much as it's like this domestic and thought about like a domesticated space, it's also a site of like resistance and like female independence and trying to like build your own, like foreground yourself and find your voice. So I think that was just like all things that I'm doing. Like I work intuitively and subconsciously, and then try and like do research and find like, well, how do I then contextualize these choices that I'm making? So for me, the interior space is also sort of like thinking about like how you can find resistance within interior spaces, and then just, sort of like inventing your own like small like Black feminist space. Like I that's what I called the if nostalgia were colored brown. These, I really don't want to mess with this. These, I called them like Black feminist spaces. Like when I was like early, like talking about the work early on, and I was trying to articulate like, what am I doing in this? I was like, these are Black feminist spaces, and just thinking about the interiority of that and how you can sort of like build your own safe space. I think I was also reading and talking a lot about like safe spaces and thinking about like, what does a safe space look like and how can you create a safe space? And I when I'm like thinking through all these concepts, like I do it through the medium of photography. So that element of like staging and construction, again, was sort of grew out of thinking about safe spaces and like Black feminist spaces.
I think something that your work does really well is provide legitimacy for the labor of self-care, because I think that's sort of a larger critique of feminist and Black feminist theory, is providing that legitimacy for sort of that emotional labor that is often not considered legitimate, because in late capitalist society that it's not monetized, you can't benefit from it monetarily, you can't you know what I mean? So it's something that is very ephemeral, and so in creating these spaces, you're sort of legitimating this notion of self-care, and while some may view it as sort of like putting you on blast and like sort of like giving out all the secrets, I think again, and for other, I think it rings true for other sort of communities that either through sort of just their identity or their own sort of practices have been marginalized, finding pride and finding beauty in those when historically they have been subjugated and marginalized and ridiculed. And so I think it's all over finding the aesthetic beauty, but also sort of the personal resistance that one can do in these sort of very small acts, or these very sort of regular quotidian everyday, and how this is legitimate to, because like the sort of the daily microaggressions that Black women have to face from every sort of corner and every facet of this world, to be able to have spaces like these where they can exist without those sort of pressures, I think speaks to a lot of people, and why your work is so important.
Yeah, I think there's this, Theaster Gates said something in a talk I recently went to. It said, like, how do you eat collard greens in mixed company? And kind of, I think, continuing that conversation for your work, like how do you speak on hair politics or body politics in mixed company when people may not have the same experiences that you do? So it's kind of like, is there, because there is labor involved in explaining someone's kind of experiences, especially if they differ greatly. So kind of do you take on that challenge to explain or to kind of educate? And I think with your work, visually being able to educate someone, to kind of give them an entryway into this is how I'm thinking, this is how you can also begin to have this dialogue is really good. I think like visually you're being able to walk through some very tough situations and discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I started off by saying like a lot of this work came out of me just not fully being resolved in one particular ground, like one standpoint. Like I mean, there was like the natural hair movement, and then, but at the same time, like there was a natural hair movement. There was still like a lot of shaming for like girls who wore weaves or girls who wore wigs, or like if you had braids and extensions, there was like a lot of shaming. So I think for me, like just the coded layer that goes into it is just out of wanting to explore like how black hair and black beauty and like the politics that are tied to it is like there's like a multiplicity to it, and it's not just this is a artist who's like taking the natural hair movement by storm, because I don't really think that I'm like necessarily only talking about like the natural hair movement in my work, or even just hair. Yeah, like I think it's, you know, like the refutation of good hair. It's kind of, well, what is good hair? Well, good hair is like there's this long history that's tied to slavery, that's tied to the way in which sort of like miscegenation and mixing happened, and like what sort of like language, and thinking about like the significance of words and language, and like how our photographs and words tied to each other. Like how can you like playing with like the puns in words and photography like that. I was just really interested in like not just making like a very didactic photograph, but like thinking about all that is sort of tied to like this notion of like black womanhood and how you can represent it. Did I answer your question? I kind of feel like I was going off on a tangent a little bit, and like I wanted to make sure I answered your question.
How do you approach language then? Because I know you write.
Yes, I'm
and
trying.
So, and I mean, that's obviously like it's, every photographer has a very different relationship to language and words. And I feel like some approach words that then sort of translate to photographs, and then some have photographs that sort of translate into language.
Yeah.
How do you position yourself in that sort of relationship between the image and the word?
I'm figuring that out as we speak, but I'm like enthusiastically figuring it out. I would say that I've actually wrote poetry. Like I have some poems that are tied to the Hair Stories Untold work, and I've like recently wrote a piece for the Journal of Feminist Scholarship. It was sort of like a mediation on my practice and thinking about how like my relationship to it now. And I'm sort of interested in thinking about how photographs are sort of like driven, like they're visually driven, right? But there are ways that you can draw meaning into it, and you can complicate like a very simple photograph through just like a simple title. And you know, just like spending time reading black feminist literature, like reading sort of like being introduced to Audre Lorde, and thinking about how she's, and Bell Hooks, and thinking about how they're like creating vocabulary around black scholarship, like black feminism and scholarship, like the biomythography, and like reading Carla Williams and Deb Willis, and they're creating words like Afrofemcentric, and like just thinking about, you know, seeing like all of the creativity that blossoms within like black women as writers. Like I'm just like really interested in sort of like how you can play in that same way. And I think that like given that I have this like visual side of me, that like this impulse to make something that people can look at, I think that that makes like a relationship to words all the more interesting. I've also been reading a lot of like Moira Davey, and just thinking about like how she just like engages with other writers. That's also just really interesting to me. So I would say my relationship to words is and writing through photography is sort of like started off with poetry, but now I'm more interested in thinking about sort of like puns, and also thinking about like long form statements and like mediations and conversations with like writers that I love, like, you know, Maya Angelou and Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, and you know, I'm just, yeah, there's, yeah.
I just realized when she was telling us the name of the title of the exhibit, More Than a Woman, made me think of the speech by Sojourner Truth, Ain't I a Woman? And I love kind of like that play, because right now you're saying, as a black woman, like, I'm more than enough. When before I wasn't even considered human. And for some people I still am not, and I'm still not treated such. But to kind of make this declaration through your work and through your presence is really powerful.
I got Aaliyah from the title.
You got a what?
Aaliyah, More Than a Woman.
I love Aaliyah more
That's
than a
what I
woman.
thought. When I saw the title, I was like, oh, Aaliyah.
Yes, Aaliyah's just like, oh, I was an Aaliyah. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about sort of like the art world, and not making art, is sort of like how there can be all these multiple interpretations of it. Yes, I definitely see the ties to Sojourner's Truth, like super important poem where you declare like, I am a woman and you will address me as such. And also loving Aaliyah growing up in like 2000, and just, she was just like the epitome of like sensuality and beauty, and just really empowering herself, and like not, like, she wore like baggy clothes, but she was like really cute. Like she had this like real like great swag to her. So like that, I think both of those points are valid. I was also just thinking about, again, just going back to like the very root of my work, where it's sort of looking beyond the body as a representation of woman. Like, I'm looking at perm kits, commercial objects, looking at home life, looking at making space, like looking at like all of these different ways to classify like the term woman. And that's sort of how I came up with the title, More Than a Woman.
And what are you working on now? Or what's some new work that we don't see in this exhibit?
Yes, so I actually have a whole series that's not on view that I just made. It was I also graduated from George Washington University in January, so that's exciting. My thesis show is called Some Assembly Required, and it also engages thinking about womanhood, but it's more or less exploring like the archive and the found image through my own family archive, and exploring my grandmother's history, migrating here from Jamaica, and then working as a domestic and also in a factory. So it's really exploring women's relationship to history, and women's relationship to labor in particular, through like my grandmother. So that's what I have. It's a combination of found photographs, some staged photographs of objects that are meant to represent my grandmother. I call them like symbolic portraits. That's kind of what I've been calling them. And some more like sort of like commercial still life imagery. So that's what's on view that is not here. And I'll be showing that work in Portland in July, and I'll be leading a creative workshop that again brings me back to like me exploring my history with like language and writing, thinking about how you can interpret found photographs through sort of like creative writing, which I'm tentatively thinking about entitling it Photo Marginalia. So that's, no one else knows that. I'm like spilling
now
beans.
everyone knows it.
Yeah, now but so yeah, I have another solo show coming up, and I'm in a book called Girl on Girl, the Gaze, Girl on Girl, Women in Photography and the Contemporary Gaze. something along those lines. I can't remember the title, but I'm in a book that it's a survey of 40 women photographers, and it's thinking about how women photographers are taking ownership of photography and creating our own gaze, and how exactly are we representing the body and issues that are tied around womanhood. And I'm in some auctions. I have some auctions coming up. I'll have some work in auctions. And HBO recently acquired my work, so there'll be some surprises there. So just a lot of things going on. Yeah.
I had a question about, so we were talking earlier about how your work sort of creates these spaces of articulation, and what did I write? So I said a lot of the mainstream reception of your work speaks to the sort of lifting of a veil of silence, which you talked about before. And so how do you accept that, and also how do you translate that into tangible moments of activism?
Oh, yes. That is that's a good question. I think that why am I going blank? I don't know. Yes, I have. So tied to my the hair politics series, Hair Stories Untold, The Reputation of Good Hair, I actually started doing workshops, which I started in 2014 at a space in Brooklyn called 5 Miles Gallery that was produced by an all-women's magazine called Top Rank. And they helped me produce a workshop, and it was about 5 or 6 girls. They were high school girls, and we came into the gallery and we did what I called hair portraits, where we took photographs of their close-up portraits of their hair and portraits of their faces, and we sort of reflected on the fullness and the beauty of everyday hair. And that was actually quite successful, and it traveled to, I ended up doing it in Virginia, because I'm actually located outside of DC now. So I did it at a nonprofit space called Space of Her Own. I came in as a photography instructor, and we literally did the same thing where we went in and the girls were able to photograph themselves. And that ended in an exhibition. And then I actually was invited at my undergrad alma mater, Rutgers University, to do the workshop again. So for me, it's important for my work to not necessarily only live within the gallery space, but how can I also translate this into something where everyday girls, everyday people can come in and have a conversation about the work, and then also just have a conversation about how the work is still relevant within their lives. Because I think that this is something that has not been, I think this is something that women deal with on a regular basis, especially Black women, within the community, outside the community. So that is sort of how I am using my work as a platform for empowerment and sort of, creative and self-expression, and, giving the babies voices because they need to be able to talk about it, so, yeah. How are we? Oh, wow, okay. Is there time for Q&As? I don't know. Okay.
Test. Already. Great. Sorry. So thank you very much. We are going to move to a Q&A. If anyone has questions, I'm going, whoa, all right, Miss Mary C. Hartfield.
Right.
All right, in the front, thank you.
How did you choose your album covers? I mean, some of them you were just a baby or not around. Some of them, so.
No, literally wasn't around. I would say, well, I have a very, very deep love for thrifting and diving for things that have been discarded and thrown and tossed aside. So I spend a lot of time in thrift stores, secondhand shops, buying objects and searching for objects. But I was really particular in terms of wanting to find albums that depicted Black women songstresses, and I wanted to work with vinyls. So it was sort of and I also wanted to work in a specific time period to sort of bring forth this feeling of nostalgia. And I think a lot about Black girl magic as a very contemporary term, but Black girl magic, I feel the 70s was that is the epitome of Black girl magic becoming this commodified object in the mainstream. So I was really interested in sort of like the time specificity of the 70s and thinking about the aesthetics of blackness and thinking about at that time, like, black beauty really became very, very profitable. And I also love disco and house and soul and R&B. And so it was a combination of just like an affinity for the 70s, an affinity for things that have sort of been discarded, but like I'm like, why would anybody get rid of this Minnie Riperton album? It is just like, this is Minnie Riperton. Why would you get rid of Melba Moore? And like, so it's like a combination of just like paying homage to like the queens of soul and R&B and just like, again, bringing what's been sort of discarded and thrown away to the forefront and to the center, and thinking about sort of black culture and black women's culture at the center of like this imagined space. It depends on the body of work you're looking at. Oh, perfect timing. So these were inspired by the boxes themselves, because the body of work, it's called Facade Objects, and it is a critique against sort of the artifice that's tied to commercial imagery, but at the same time, I wanted to work with the palettes that were available. So in my mind, I was like, I'm gonna critique this, but I'm also gonna work within the traditions of the medium to just kind of make the critique even more sort of like nuanced and subtle. So I was working with an available palette for those. And for sort of like the hair stories untold, I was really interested in thinking about sort of what colors signify and what colors represent. Really wanted to sort of showcase feminine, like thinking about femininity, like what are colors that are soft? What are colors that represent beauty? What are colors that sort of tie back to sort of this product of selling beauty, really? And those are sort of the palettes that I continually would come to, sort of the pinks, the purples, the blues. So really, I would say that's where it came from, just like working within the palette of the industry the industry that informs the ideologies. And like this, like it's actually, that pillow is actually that color. But that's also, that image is more for me an exploration of material. Like it's all satin, like everything in that picture is satin. But yeah, that's where it comes from, like the objects themselves, like the objects inform the palette. And then just also thinking about the cultural significance of color and thinking about how like color can sort of ignite sort of feelings or different readings. I've sort of moved away a little bit from color being so heavy in my more recent work, and I'm more or less looking at sort of like texture and pattern. I'm very visual. I'm just very visual. Like I like looking at things and making someone think they're looking at one thing and tricking them and be like, oh, this is actually not what you're looking at. It's actually like something else. This is not actually a commercial photograph of someone trying to sell a perm kit.
Can you tell us a little bit about the photographs, the pictures where the women have the hair in their mouths, and about either ingestion or just let us know what you're thinking about those.
Did you say about ingestion?
Yeah, is it ingesting the hair, or is it internalizing, or?
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to make sure I heard right. I made that work in 2012, and I went natural around that time. So this was me trying to figure out what that meant, because on one side, I felt like it was a very empowering and beautiful thing to cut your hair off and go natural. But on the other side, I was being met with sort of like backlash and like, you can't get a job if you have an afro. No one will hire you. So I was sort of thinking about like how unfair it is And I wanted to sort of explore the history of like hair texture and thinking about how the texture of your hair sort of informs the way you're viewed upon. And this also goes back to my comment earlier about thinking about like the multiplicity of hair and Black women who wear hair. So each of the models are wearing their hair differently. Like there's a model with like a buzz cut, there's a model with a big afro, there's a model with a weave, there's a model with locks. So I really wanted to sort of explore like the multiplicity of Black hair, but also talk about the way that the absurdity that is tied to sort of like coding what type of hair is beautiful and what type of hair is not, and thinking about the way in which we ingest ideas and we take in ideas and we internalize them, and it's all tied to sort of like texture. So they're eating, they're eating kanekalon, which is like the soft, silky, synthetic fabric. It's essentially it's fake hair, and I really wanted to sort of like visualize a pun, like good hair, like what, like literally represent good hair, like a model eating hair, just to like show the absurdity that's in it. So it's sort of tied to like the politics of texture, the way in which like European beauty standards are deemed like beautiful and thought of as like you have to have this, but underneath all of that, like Black women are embracing all different types of hair, and like we're not going to apologize for it. So it's a little bit of thinking of like the historical meaning of good hair, and like how can I visualize that through a photograph and also turn it on its head, critique it, and also be like, I can do what I want to do. I'm going to do what I want to do, and you can't really put a finger on how a woman decides to dress herself or style herself.
I think we have time for one more question. No? Yeah? No?
This was briefly touched upon earlier about being, I guess, like anti-capitalistic. Is that tied into your work at all?
I think so. I think it's most evident in the series Facade Objects with the perm kits, where it mimics like early commercial photography. It's very visually pleasing and minimal, and it's very like the product is at the center, but the product that's being sold is also obscured through the chemicals. So there's this way of sort of like disrupting the cell. So I definitely think that there is a critique against capitalism within my work, and I would say it's most evident in the Facade Objects series.
Thank you, Andy and Martina, and especially Nakeya, for being here this evening and for sharing your information with us. As I mentioned to many of us who were here when we very first kicked off, there will be a reception immediately following our conversation. And so if you have questions and you didn't quite want to say them into a microphone, please say them to our speakers and amongst ourselves as we move into the first floor to celebrate not only the artist and these wonderful curators being here with us, but also the release of the exhibition catalog for More Than a Woman. Nakeya will be in the gallery where her work is, signing books for just for a brief amount of time at the beginning of the reception, so that we can be sure that we're able to spend time speaking with people as they're here and celebrating. Again, my name is Heather Duffy. I'm the exhibitions curator here at UICA. Please find me if you have questions or want to talk about things that maybe are not specifically related to More Than a Woman. But I really want to talk about that the most, so that's what we're going to do. Also, a big thanks again to all of our sponsors, to all of our members, to our committee, to Vault Catering and Events, who has really graciously brought a bounty of delicious treats for us, which are upstairs in the studio. Please join us upstairs, and we'll continue our conversation there. Thank you.